I want to hand
Okay.
over to you, Professor Hugh Williams, who's generously agreed, and it's becoming increasingly apparent how generous you are because we've had some hiccups this morning, generously agreed to speak in our first free webinar to the UK neuropsychology community on neurodiverse children and young people and the risk of social exclusion. I'm really looking forward to what you've got to say, Hugh.
Yes.
Do we let you go?
Good. Thank you very much, Ingram. Okay. Well, hello and good morning. Thank you for bearing with us. A few technical issues, but we're here now, as you were. And as Ingram was saying, please do post your questions as going on, because Ingram can then collate those questions. But there'll be a Q&A towards the end. And Ingram, feel free to let me know if I'm loud enough, too loud, or whatever. So I'm just checking the time so I know what's going on.
No, it's fine right now, Hugh.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk about the concept of neurodiverse and social justice, effectively. So neurodiverse is kind of factors that influence the development of the brain in a way in which trajectory is either delayed away from normal development. It may be deviated or may be forestalled in various ways. So the kind of factors there, I will kind of get to a number of factors, the main one being traumatic brain injury, biggest cause of death and disability in kids and young people worldwide, and the silent epidemic, as well known to some who know that concept, but other factors that are often in the mix. So research is in a number of countries, largely UK, but and then South Africa and bits in America and so on as well. So some of the other factors, alcohol and drug misuse in the person or in their parents, directly in fetal alcohol syndrome, for example, traumatic experiences that may influence brain development. So I won't talk much about that today, but that's another area that we're doing work in. So these often coalesce alongside other neural disabilities, ADHD, autism spectrum type disorders and so on as well. So what I'm hoping to emerge out of what I'm talking about today, and Ingram did say that I should just take it a little bit of I'm not quite sure what he did say. Something along the lines of just kind of talk about stuff that's of interest to you at the moment, which is what I'll probably do. So the school and social exclusion is particularly important every which way around, personally, for lots of reasons. If I have time, I'll come back to that. But school is the engine of social development, and so incredibly important that there's inclusion of kids with disabilities of other types into schools. A bit of an overview of various conflicts of interest or confluences of interest and funding, and the main ones to draw attention to, currently funded by the ESRC, also Barrow Cadbury Trust, who have been fantastic during the COVID process, where we can't access prisons. We're doing our research, we're doing other things with the Barrow Cadbury Trust around vulnerable populations. Devon and Cornwall Police and Home Office funding around heroin and crack cocaine, vulnerability and improving custody care, and then various advisory roles to do with, currently of interest might be the COVID working group for the Division Neuropsychology, kind of steering that, and there's a couple of papers coming out on COVID and neurocognitive processing soon. And relevant to this talk, Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty for the UN and UN Office of Drugs and Crime. And Pink Concussions, which you might be interested in, which is the organization that looks at girls and women's experience after head injury, run by Catherine Snedeker. And there's an audience polling process, so just bear with me, get rid of that. Oops. Please go down. Yeah. So, as people may know, my background is more in neuropsychological rehabilitation than anything else, really. Clinical psychology, neuropsychology rehabilitation. With Barbara Wilson and John Evans, the Oliver Senkbeil Center, we looked at how to develop brain injury rehabilitation for mostly young people after brain injury and strokes. had injured in car accidents and all the rest of it. But then after I switched to working in academia, I took an accidental detour into prison populations. And in this sort of detour, found that people who end up in prisons are often described as lacking impulse control, poor at controlling their emotions, poor at thinking about the consequences of action, and empathy seems to be rather lacking. And the population also tends to be relatively young, so there's a spike in crime between 15 and 23. About 20–25% of the prison population is in that sort of age group. And those who start young, 10, 11, or get convicted around that time, often end up being persisting offenders across their lifetime. So there's, rather than adolescents, limited offenders. So crime tends to be something that of the relatively young, and also tends to be something of the male variety, with about 90–95% of people who end up in the criminal justice system being male. So it's sort of tweaked my interest looking at those sort of issues that what might be going on in this population. Many of you will be aware, if you have a neuropsychological background, and of the ways in which our understanding of brains and what they do and how they do it has evolved a lot in the last few years, especially when we've become much more aware of how the brain is a connectome, so the massive connectivity in the brain. So, you know, the 100 billion neurons with their 15 to 30,000 connections for each neuron. My son was trying to work out the other day what the power of that was in terms of connectivity, which is tremendous. And the connectivity is constantly kind of evolving and shaping. So doing a basic task, as I am now, kind of holding something in mind and thinking about what's going to happen next, reminding one of my teenagers to not wander in front of camera or what have you. There's so much going on in one's working memory, but it's connected back to various stores and processing kind of systems. And when you're holding anything in mind, there's an interaction of various things. Last time I saw Ingram was in a pub, which is a lovely thing, a pub, and I'm seeing in Ingram were a couple of pints, and there was a nice visual memory in my right temporal kind of cortex, bringing through to my frontal lobes. So the connectivity is the thing when it comes to the brain, and the ways in which there are these wonderful kind of filaments that bundle up into the diffuse matter tracts that allow us to do what we do, to think, to remember, to plan ahead, to feel. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it's not. It's a wonderfully, relatively fluid sort of system in a way. And this is just to highlight the way in which, well, I really like this graph from Ron Savage. He's savage by name, but gentle by nature. And so Ron put this overview together of the periods at which the brain's going through particularly active bursts of development. And then go back up. The first main start around age, kind of 1.5, 3, the first teenage years is when your child turns to you and says, "No, Daddy, no," because they realize they can control you through the use of language. And then 7, 8, 9, they become little kind of off philosophy kings and queens, and then 13, 14, where the hormonal shifts have happened. So by age 14, you've got the biggest distance between the feeling state of wanting and the capacity to temper that wanting with a little bit of sense and sensibility. The procreation as recreation kicks in 14, 15, but the decision making that goes along with it is pretty, unfortunately, shoddy. So we end up with all kinds of problems. I was sharing with Ingram before I started this, I'm looking at Devon Cornwall data sets at the moment, and quite amazing kind of stuff happens at various points, risk-taking behaviors and all the rest of it. It makes you quite relieved that you haven't got too much of that going on. But moving swiftly along, the brain is still evolving, shaping and sculpting itself into being throughout the mid to late adolescence. So if we think of by now, effectively, up to maybe 23, 24 is a period where there's finally some kind of neurological kind of stability. Some people argue that the brain is at its most settled in the early 40s. And then that's it then until other things happen. Anyway, moving swiftly along. The brain then is a system that's evolving in response to environmental conditions. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the big unfortunate events that can happen is traumatic brain injury, especially in younger people. Come back to the risk-taking stuff that happens after 14, 15, 16, wanting to be with your mates, putting everything else on hold because you're in a rush to be in a rush and all the rest of it. So there's risk-taking kind of going on, just getting that bit of the screen. And so the brain injury, as many of you I'm sure will be aware, is gradable in various ways, traumatic brain injury, from mild concussions where you may have a few seconds or minutes loss of consciousness. If you go more than 10 minutes loss of consciousness, that's maybe a complicated mild injury, and more than 20 or 30 minutes LOC, that's a moderate severe brain injury. And you can imagine in this scenario, kind of there at the top, a baseball bat to the front of the head, leading to maybe hematomas towards the front and contusions, and then the brain hitting the back of the skull internally, therefore leading to contra-coup injuries. And then as the brain is wobbling inside the brain, simsami, the Welsh word for that, simsami, then there could be the tearing of the diffuse white matter tracts, or at the very least it gets put in jeopardy, leading to even more edema building up and so on and so forth, leading to pressure on the brainstem, leading to unconsciousness and so on and so forth. The common areas affected in brain injury across the spectrum of severity of brain injury is the frontal system. So in these, the little graphic there on the right, consecutive series of head injuries and autopsy in William Elwyn Lishman's book, Organic Psychiatry, are where injuries have happened on post-mortem. So it tends to be frontal and temporal and limbic systems, particularly at risk in adolescence as well. So the picture tends to be then of injuries to the frontal, temporal, limbic sort of systems, and so on. And just as a slight aside, but just to drive the issue home, the brain sits inside the skull, and the inside of the skull on the basal part is quite jaggedy rather than smooth. And as the brain might be simsamming or moving around inside the skull a little bit, it might shudder and judder against these bits of bone. So it's a bit like jello on a cheese grater, unfortunately. So, next slide, sorry, just going to the next slide if I can. Ah, there we are. So this is from a lovely overview in Lancet Neurology by David Menon and Anthony Matz on the consequences of brain injury worldwide, Lancet Neurology V2, VU, and looking at the hematomas, the diffuse white matter tracts, and so on. And to the right there, you can see on a diffuse axonal shearing after brain injury, and also loss over time. So after recovery, initial recovery, complete decline as well. We're not quite sure why that happens. It could be immunological systems and so on. Anyway, so so brain injury is a relatively common, unfortunately the most common disorder of childhood and adolescence and young adulthood. 12% of adults in a given society are thought to have had a brain injury with a loss of consciousness. So that could be a few seconds, minutes or more. So 1 in 10-ish. If you look at that graph there, you'll see that there's a big spike reminiscent of the risk of crime in, back up, previously. So you got their urban dwelling boys being the big group having fights, falls, especially on booze and probably other drugs too. If you track backwards to the under fives, Luke Mounce, one of my colleagues, did a reanalysis of some data for us recently and found that if you're under 5, from the poorest 5% of our community, you're 5 times more likely to have a head injury. So social deprivation is a driver of brain injury. You're twice as likely to have orthopedic injuries and 5 times more likely to have traumatic brain injuries. So just bear that in mind. And injury and violence are the leading cause of death in the 10 to 24 age group and so on. So the consequence of brain injury, and so I think it's in the UK context, obviously our living post-brain injury rates are improving, but living with disability is the problem. So this is for kids. Quick summary is that after moderate severe brain injury, there could be problems that we kind of see as organic personality change, problems with irritability, not remembering very well, and inattention, and behavior being a bit disturbed. They're just executive type issues, really. And after mild brain injuries, there's increased evidence that the adolescent brain is not just more likely to get itself injured, unfortunately, but also to have long-term consequences post-injury. It's nice data from Norway and other data sets, because it's going through change in development. So at these points of change in development, the brain is more vulnerable, we think. The two key neurocognitive factors are impulsivity, so not doing too well on Stroop type tasks, and trails. Trails B or not trails B, that is a question, a really nice paper by James Tonks, who's in the audience somewhere. So we think about 15 to 30% of kids, even maybe more, after mild brain injuries may have, especially in the first year, have ongoing problems. Secondary ADHD and oppositional kind of defiant disorder, in other words, not doing what they're told, maybe not understanding what they've been told, maybe not being able to comply with instructions because they're irritable and all the rest of it. So 3 or 4 kids in 10 after brain injury across the spectrum may have ongoing issues. So another additional issue, and James and I have been working on this over the last few years, is emotion processing from brain injury. In adults, it's pretty well documented. 25–30% of adults with brain injury have problems with alexithymia, or being able to read other people's emotions or no one's own emotions. So I'm just noticing down there those 2 jokers who got Brexit for us, woohoo. And there we are. Reading emotions, that's on the day of their celebration. Reading emotions is a very important part of what we do as humans, clearly. I think those young people there are reacting to Trump being elected, I think, or the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. The point is that there's a whole heap of systems that work together in concert, the fusiform gyri, amygdala, frontal systems, or prefrontal cortex, and so on, for giving us an understanding of other people's emotions and reacting to those appropriately. And increasingly, it's been shown just by James and I a few years ago, showing that kids with brain injury are particularly poor on reading emotions from the face, even static pictures like this one of the mind and the eyes, and having pragmatic social skills of dealing with everyday kind of life, knowing what's going on. Some very interesting but sad cases. One kid that we interviewed on a bus kept talking to somebody, and then got punched in the face because the guy that he was trying to talk to didn't want to talk to him, so he was kind of giving him all the non-verbal, so don't talk to me, but that didn't work, and other kind of things of that nature. So that's a little bit of background on neurocognitive issues, brain trauma. And when it comes to crime, my colleague Audrey McKinley in New Zealand did a longitudinal birth cohort study, finding that if you had a mild brain injury as a kid of about 5, you nearly doubled pretty much your chances 2 years later, 7 or 8 or 9, to have problems with attention and concentration in school. By the time you're 11 or 12, you started to get excluded from school. By the time you're 14, 15, you're in trouble with the law, fire setting, violence, and so on and so forth. In a large-scale representative study of the US population, a recent report showed that there was increased risk. Again, it's nearly doubling the risk of issues like mental health problems, drug and alcohol problems, and criminality in context of brain injury. So brain injury is like an accelerant, maybe of underlying issues, so I can come back to that question if you like, or setting a new set of issues in train. A very interesting and nice new study just out on a Chicago population of kids, finding that across the age span, 2 years down the line, one of the main predictors of problems to do with internalizing problems and externalizing problems, so depression, anxiety, and irritability and anger and criminal violence, was head injury, so doubling the risk of these sort of problems. Again, it seems to be the common kind of finding. So we did one of our studies years ago was in Exeter Prison. We asked how many of you have had a head injury at some point, and so compared to the general population, around 10-12%, we find 60% plus having a head injury history. And again, James did the analysis to show that if there was a head injury history, then people were in prison from age 16 versus 21. We did a follow-up study with young offenders, Young Offending Institute. At the time, about maybe 1,300 kids were in prison at this time, maybe 1,500. It's down to about 850 now. And we managed to get about 95% recruitment rate and found that a loss of consciousness was present in around 46% of the overall sample. Many, about 1 or 2 in 10, with moderate severe brain injury. And the more brain injuries, the more violent. I can get into this data a bit more if people wanted to. We then worked with the Youth Justice Secure System, particularly with somebody called Howard Jasper. I'll come back to in a bit. And Howard was getting together with Proceeded with Chester Beeson to make sure that kids on entry into a secure estate will be assessed for disability to do with learning disabilities, but also mental health, suicidality, drug abuse, and so on, and now head injury in the mix as well, and based on our screening tool. In here, in this study, we looked at the first 93 adolescent boys who came in and into the youth estate, and I just want to highlight this issue. If there was no or very mild TBI, so no ongoing post-concussion types of symptoms of forgetting and stuff like that, then no equals self-harm rates around 43%, suicidality factors around 24% presence. In the one to moderate severe brain injury, we have a higher we've got higher levels of self-harm and suicidality in more than 50% or 50%. Being in care being a big issue as well. So you, again, are much more present in the ones with traumatic brain injury symptoms. And these are ongoing problems to do with brain injury, not just you had one, but you have ongoing issues that would indicate brain injury is a factor. This was independent of depression, so it's like neuroregulation of emotion and affect being an issue. The work around is brain injury an issue in people in prisons has been added to by some opportunistic studies in Germany where, as we're now very aware, there's some very nice healthcare systems in Germany where people are responsive and sensible and all the rest of it, well done them. And in prison systems, people get scanned if they have a bit of a sneeze or whatever. And there's lots of data. So they looked at MRI data and CT scan data and compared violent versus non-violent versus non-offending populations. And they find that in the general population, let's say 10%-ish have some kind of lesions. In the non-violent offenders, maybe it's around 30-40%. In the violent offenders, it's more like 60 to 70. So people who end up in our prison systems tend to be poor and engaging in treatments, not surprising because they don't remember what's going on, they're impulsive. Higher levels of infractions, referred to above, higher levels of reconviction, which is a big issue, and often in areas of violence. We've been recently doing work with the Disability Trust and other colleagues at Royal Holloway around women in prison, and we find that in women in prison, about 65% also have had head injury. And one of the big causes of brain injury in the women in prison is domestic violence. Recently, we have a paper coming out soon with Amanda Kirby and Eric Cleaton, I think Bethany Clasby, on the profiles of adult females in Scottish prisons. And this is some preliminary data. And in this, we're just also highlighting some of the young male data as well as kind of behavioral comparison. And I just want to pull out a few key points that in both populations, this is about 100 plus women in prison. There's this huge female population considering the numbers. Deficits in attention and concentration, very common in both groups. Deficits in social communication were very common. So the DeWitt profile is what we use here, and the DeWitt profile gives a readout of, are your skills good? So you're in band 4. Are you reasonable? You can pretty much follow what's going on. You've got the skill sets for being able to pay attention in a classroom situation or in work. Or 2, many challenges, or 1, significant challenges. And I just want to bring your attention to in the female offenders, there's it's a dose-response relationship between the severity of head injury in terms of loss of consciousness and the number of skills deficits. In other words, the more severe the injuries they've had, the more likely they are to have deficits in their skill mix, communication-wise, being able to pay attention, to know what's going on. And they themselves describe that they have problems in social settings and in being able to understand other people and making eye contact and being able to follow what's going on. So that, some of the vital stuff for day-to-day life. We also looked at their records, and the records would indicate they're really just shouldn't really have said or done what they did in a situation that could have been de-escalated in a public place, and just getting into verbal and then kind of physical aggression, that could have easily not have had to happen. Vitally, it tells you, links back to the exclusion stuff, then it was much more likely that the female offenders and male offenders with the more deficits in their areas of day-to-day life skills have been excluded from school. And they're likely being excluded 3 or 4 times. So in the end, they're on trajectory for permanent school exclusion, effectively, or self-exclusion by the end of it. And attention and concentration were particularly affected. So you can see the bit of effect they all kind of were probably not knowing what's going on. And have I lost you? Are you there, Ingram?
I'm here.
Okay, good. I had a thing come up to say, whoa, that would be poetic, wouldn't it? Exclusion, bang. You're out. Okay. Bethany Claspy, one of my colleagues, did the reanalysis of some more data recently and found that in a very nice, sophisticated model, that school exclusion was predictable on the basis of presence of head injury, and then ending up in the criminal justice system was also predicted on the basis of head injury. So you can just, so this really does add towards the work of that I mentioned from New Zealand on head injury being a problem. And as Victor Hugo said, he who opens a school door closes a prison. To right. In terms of getting this across to policymakers, we did an analysis with the Centre of Mental Health, Cecina Fassel, myself and Tom McMillan, with the Centre of Mental Health. The upshot is effectively that most head injuries, 90% of episodes of head injury in your typical 15-year-old will cost, in terms of GP costs, A&E costs, family costs and so on, about £95,000-ish, something like that, £95,000. But because head injury is such a big factor in violent crime, you add another £65,000 per case. And if the kid is already in contact with the law, then it's another $250,000. So then that starts to aggregate into rather big numbers. It's in the billions of the cost of brain injury through crime. Brain injury is neurodisability. It's one of the neurodisabilities. As I mentioned, this is about neurodiverse populations. Nathan Hewson and I were asked by the Office of the Children's Commissioner to do a review of how many kids in prison systems have neurodisability. And if you look at the bottom, fetal alcohol syndrome in general population, let's say maximum 5%, say, in some contexts. In South Africa, it's 10% in the general population. General population, 10%. In prison populations, typically about 10 to maybe 15%. But then we need to think about what kind of drugs are also affecting things. If they go up, brain injury, autism spectrum disorder, 15% of kids incarcerated. Dyslexia, ADHD, elevated levels. Big one is communication disorders, which is your soft sign that something's not quite right. So about 5% of the kids in general community 60 to 90% of kids in custody. So it's an indicator. So we think we should be doing a hell of a lot more to try to help identify the communication problems that then will be an indication that there is autism spectrum disorders, there is brain injury, there is ... The women in prison in Scotland, I would mention in another analysis we'll be doing, would indicate that they had social communication problems, got into horrible relationships, were used for carrying drugs, and then were being battered by their horrible partners and so on. Well, that's the reading that we took from it. So they're multiply kind of victimized, and there's a new scheme happening in Wales soon to put more therapeutic communities up instead of incarceration. So neurovulnerability in justice systems is a little graphic that Hope put together with my fantastically competent research assistant to keep me on task, and James Tonks. So here we kind of try to summarize some of the factors that play. Of course, there are many. Early life adversity, adverse childhood experiences, maternal substance use, chaotic home environment, substance use, poor social interactions, and neurodiverse, all cycling around traumatic brain injury as a bit of a vortex leading to problems and entering the criminal justice system. So what to do, I suppose. So quite luckily, I bumped into a human rights lawyer in a workshop. Was helping with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime in the Mideast to work with judges there. And we arrived at, it would be interesting to put in a note into the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child Justice, which has been reviewed for the first time in 30 years. And so we put in an overview to how many kids with disabilities end up in criminal justice systems worldwide. And their response was to say, yes, wow, that's interesting, and something needs to be done about it, which is good. So kids with neurodisability in the system need to be assessed for. But it went beyond that and said that there should be more done to stop the kids ending up there in the first place. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has come in for 198 signatories of the UN Convention. One of the few countries not signed up to it is the USA, unfortunately. But, and I'll give you some links to that. Other things in New Zealand, this is Judge Beecroft, who saw our data on, Nathan's data on kids in custody with neuro issues. And so they decided to put in more assessments at the time where they're coming for before they see a judge. And then the judge gets to know whether the kid who's before them for charges of fire setting, for example, has a neurodisability, and then they can plan restorative justice in the community that's sensitive to their cultural history, Maori or Pākehā, and so on. Judge Beecroft is now the New Zealand Children's Commissioner, and this was also taken to the UN as a model for what to do in terms of children's rights and rehabilitation. Other kind of initiatives, there's a really nice initiative in Wales, enhanced intervention to bring more clinical support in early, reducing crime by 30%, incarceration by 40%. And just before I end, and then there's sentencing guidelines coming through that have mentioned brain injury, but we're now on neurodisability, and hopefully there'll be a renewed version of that coming through soon on for both magistrates and judges to take account of neurodisability. My colleague Howard Jasper, who gave me these overheads, just to highlight that the 800 to 900 young people currently in our youth secure systems are starting to get more therapeutic environments rather than just being incarcerated within schooling. So about a third now are in what we call Secure Stairs, which is a trauma-informed therapeutic community. And that's Johnny Matthews from Wales used just this kind of emphasised. Behaviour is the symptom, skew development, of course. To help, we need to address development, which is exactly what they're trying to do by bringing together a whole heap of different approaches. Trauma-informed, systemic, psychodynamic, brain development, neuroscience, attachment issues, bringing these together to be better at informing and formulating what's going on for these young people who have very traumatic histories very often. And that's just another kind of representation of the ways in which Secure Stairs sits as where kids will be ending up maybe needing that more intensive intervention in custody. but then increasing into community, but then all the way up to restorative justice approaches and critical case in the community. If you want more details on this, we can, Howard and I are planning some work together and some teaching. So one of the key gatekeepers into the criminal justice system is the police. The police see themselves as sometimes the secret social services because they have to respond. And we're seeing it now. Obviously, domestic violence spilling onto the street sometimes when I'm around. This is in Lancet Child Adolescent Health. Nathan led on this. In what the police can be doing in terms of responding more sensitively to young people and adults with neurodisability so that they can divert away from the criminal justice system and also not get false confessions or whatever it might be, the problems that attend this population. And we can improve custody care so it doesn't become custody, it becomes pre-custody diversion away from the criminal justice system. So this is towards concluding now really, but children and young people most likely to have TBIs and other neurodisabilities that create a neuro adverse life history. They don't grow out with problems, but grow into them because they need stimulation, socialization, acceptance, inclusion to be able to thrive. School inclusion is vital. Diversion liaison is vital for kids who are particularly at risk. Parents and caregiver support, either the parents through family or the parents through society as carers and so on, really need to be supported properly. Screening for TBIs and other disabilities is possible, can be done very effectively and quickly. Pre-custody and divert, in custody and divert, in sentencing and community orders can be given, and also we can improve our ways of working with these young people to resettle in community. Multi-agency working is incredibly important, and I'm currently working, and if people are interested in this, with a Do It Profile company on a non-profit app that allows kids and their families to note what the problems are and what the best ways of handling the problems are, so that it can be much more effective as kind of community rehabilitation. Some resources people might find useful from our original report on brain injury, repair and shattered life, and other resources available to you. Okay, then I'm looking to you, Ingram.
Sorry, Hugh, I've just taken a few seconds to unmute myself.
That's unusual.
Yeah, it's not usually as slow as that, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, the kind of questions that I might save my Twitter questions until I've had a glass of wine and I can contact you on Twitter later on. There's a couple of comments and questions from our audience, but I just firstly wanted to thank you for bearing with us and taking us through some really interesting research. And I've heard you talk a number of times, and obviously in the main, I'm utterly convinced that this is an area that we need to focus on and pay attention to, because it is potentially hidden, isn't it, within this within the populations that we reach out to. Services are often discordant with the underlying needs, and I think what you're guiding us towards is a way of thinking about crime and neurodiversity and treatment approaches that are more likely to work because they understand the etiology and the patterns better. There's a couple of comments and questions, and I just invite people to ask questions in the chat and also elsewhere. I'm just keeping an eye on the time, make sure that we don't run over. I think we've got a few minutes for discussion. Maybe if we take see how we go in 10 minutes and aim to finish at 11:35. We won't be too far behind what people were expecting. Amanda Owen, one of our colleagues, says she's been hearing from colleagues about children with brain injury who've been adopted, fostered, kids with ASD, neurodevelopmental issues, and particularly in the context of COVID, a marked reduction in anxiety and progress with learning, which she's raised on Twitter. So I'm wondering if you have any particular kind of COVID related thoughts, which I think is behind Amanda's question about how we can understand how these children are doing at the moment.
I think there's a cloak of COVID kind of murkiness around these things. I mean, James is on here, and he was telling he's much more on in the clinical interface than I would be. But that there are many kids who are actually not having and James can say more about this, not feeling demanded of, are able to pace things appropriately. And we know that schools can be schools are wonderful environments, but the way they have been organised around all this sort of sex stuff all the time is quite stressful for the teachers and kids. So maybe that's a factor. But at the same time, the cloak is that the organised, drug gangs and so on, they trade in people as well as drugs. They trade in vulnerable people as well as drugs, because vulnerable people are access to homes, to drug selling, and all the rest of it. So I suspect there's a lot going on that we're not aware of, because there's the police in a position of being able to be more present in some way, because there's this tidal wave of people out of society, but they're coming back in. So it's an interesting. I'm aware that in police force terms that there is a huge need to try to pick up on where the vulnerable people are, what's happening to them. So the ones who may be plugged into services are doing okay, because you've got somebody kind of checking in and all the rest of it, but those who are not, and I really worry over the long-term future of vulnerable people, because there's how there will be justifications around the tax spend and so on. So I think we need to make sure that we don't get sucked into some kind of post-COVID. We need to kind of not spend. We need to spend on NHS and social care staff and systems and multi-agency working. And I think the police are particularly important in this. I repeat this because they're getting more resources, and those resources could be more geared towards the kind of social support systems and social protection that they can do and provide.
Thank you, Hugh. There's a question that comes from a very different place in your talk, a comment really about the brain maturation phases that you showed. I was kind of struck by the brain being quietest in the 40s. I've used a variety of different metrics of maturation. I've not seen that reference before. It's an interesting one. And you, in your lumps and bumps slide, I think, Mauricio says that the maturation process of the brain in the last slide is coincidental with logical developmental stages articulated by Piaget. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about the links between sort of brain maturation and other conceptual frameworks that might inform our understanding of how we think.
There's that work, again, James is on this, but in his PhD years ago, we looked at, effectively we found support for Piagetian and Vygotskian stage of development. You've got maturation, but it needs to be in social context. So it's a yes. And James, you can put a reference up to the paper in which that's represented, maybe the developmental medicine and child neurology paper, which is quite good on emotion processing and its development.
So maybe James can, if we haven't caught James snoozing, maybe James can post that. One of the disadvantages of this format, as you know, Hugh, is that because we can have a large number of members of the audience, we can't necessarily easily hand them a mic, although I'm willing to be educated.
If there's
a post in the chat, can you?
We can post that in the chat, James, if you don't mind. And then the paper on the cases showing that which kids had deficit in social emotion processing per se issues, and some on executive that then affected the social communication, and then both, and who are kind of okay. One of the really nice papers that, again, James again, he might want to do one of these, was a comparison of kids in CAMS and what their levels and needs were. And they were getting supported by CAMS, and then kids with brain injury and what their levels and needs were compared to the normative population. And their levels and needs were the same as the kids in CAMS, but they weren't getting any support because, were not available. So, Fergus Gray did the replication of that in East Anglia, which is interesting. So, often neglected, this population, obviously. Sorry, next question.
There's some comments here, Hugh. I was just looking at sorry, I wasn't. Just looking at Twitter there for a second, thinking there was some comments about your seminar on there. But there's a question, the comments here about, Helen makes an interesting point, I think, about our conceptual framework. This is Helen Rodwell saying the research is interesting and frightening. She works with looked after adopted children. Common practice to frame all these under an attachment lens. worried about how many of these children might have experienced TBI, whether that's known or unknown. And when assessing children looking at medical records, she may not have all of the relevant info. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's frightening that obviously attachment is a key kind of feature of child development, but it's not the only feature. And if you miss out on a neurodisability, you may end up, not really being able to offer a way of enabling behavior to change. And attachment can be so compromised by the neurodisability anyway. So we haven't published this, but years ago, it was a nice study showing that kids with brain injury, neurodisability, and the parents and levels of stress and family function, that at 5 years and 10 years, that the parents who had to use effectively kind of more force and control in the context of greater dysexecutive problems in the kid. So therefore you'd be thinking, oh, attachment's a big issue. No, it's dysexecutive syndrome triggers a lot of having to be so controlling, but the parents are really stressed and depressed, and it didn't stop at 5 years. It was ongoing. It was just ongoing. So I think it's a proper biopsychosocial formulation is needed, where an accounting is taken of the neurodisability and the trauma and the attachment histories. They're all interactional. So the data would show in terms of effect size, population level, that a brain injury is a standout factor in aggression, in internalized problems, in suicidality, in drug misuse. So not to account for it is just horrendous.
Hugh, there's a couple of related questions. One from Helen, who makes that excellent point, and thank you, Helen, also for the tweet that distracted me from Hugh's response. But you ask also, how is it best to screen for TBI? So a couple of questions about how would you screen. So if you don't know what you don't know, right? I think that's what's behind Helen's point. How do we
unknowable unknowns? Again, the fog of invisibility. So basic questions. When we found that asking questions, if you ask, have you had a brain injury? It doesn't work. But if you ask, have you been knocked out? And how long will that for? There you go. Asking questions that are in people's language, what they understand. Talk about concussion is useful because that's a way in to talk about brain injury, because people don't think of it as brain injury. And domestic violence, huge issue, massive issue in domestic violence.
Hugh, do you think, so in terms of those screening questions, so Tom Laverick asks a similar question, it'd be great if people use particular screening questions, could they share them? You're talking about the phraseology, so using head injury or knocked out, if you ever bumped your head might be a sensible thing.
What we try to do, there's what we found we helped develop the CHAT, a comprehensive health assessment tool. It takes a long time, but in there's the brain injury questions, and it's quite short. And we used Nigel King's post-concussion syndrome Rivamid, and Luke Mounts did an analysis of the Rivamid A&E data and found a 6-item version that's pretty good, pretty stable. And the key component, key finding, a number of studies, Miriam Cohen study that just looking at the moment, and another couple, that the cognitive sequelae, if present currently, are associated with more problems, basically. So social problems, violence. So that's kind of forgetting and problems of concentration. So we're kind of finding about the history of the concussion or head injury, and then finding about current symptoms. But you can do that in a pretty short screen. Other screens available, Ohio State is very good. That's now going online, can be used on online. We've just done that with the police, finding there's elevated levels of TBI in police. And the Disability Trust have a measure, the BISI, that's short and being used. Just saw that come up. That's used in a number of settings. And we're working with Disability Trust around how to enhance that in domestic violence, because in domestic violence, there's another stream of work we've got going. We have to think about anoxia and from strangulation and from drownings as well. So, which ones are you going for?
Do you have a view on severity? There's a question here about severity, a comment about severity. I suppose in screening, in terms of the context I work in, with very different goals in mind. Would normally look at presentation to hospital and possibly admission to hospital as being an important marker of severity. Would you agree with that, or do you want to include all those who've had out of hospital concussion experiences?
Good point, Ingram. I think the point that is underneath your point latently is that, it's important to look at the hospitalisation, but the more deprived would not get to hospital. No, you take them there and be frightened of losing your kids, or you'll be in the context of domestic violence, so it's hard to leave the house and access and all the rest of it. So in ours and other work, especially in some Tom McMillan's work, showing that there's a lot of brain injury, but it hasn't. When you look at hospital records of prisoners in Scotland, you find a lot of brain injury, hematomas, hemorrhages, and all the rest of it, relative to the general population in the prisoners who look at NHS records. But even that is a massive underestimate of the actual levels. And when you look at the women in prison, less than 5% had their brain injury known to them or notified to services. And one who couldn't see out of her eyes when she had 3 batterings in one day, just said that, oh, is that a brain injury? Is it? Sort of thing. And it's like, people just don't know that it's an issue.
There's a couple of comments about fetal alcohol syndrome and a call for maybe greater discussion about those kinds of issues on webinar.
Absolutely.
I'm very happy to kind of pick up anything in the chat and respond to that in terms of future planning.
Fetal alcohol in the context of commonly used drugs these days. Yeah. So if you think about the shift from alcohol in the under 18s to cannabis, for example, under the drugs, and so there's a bit of a interesting mix going on. It'd be nice to have a session on this all together with some A&E people as well as some pediatricians around kind of what might be happening. Pediatric neurology, because it's a fascinating area. But do we know the effects? We know that cannabis has effects. They may not if you come off. I don't know. There's a lot of factors there that need to be unpacked. And absolutely right.
Okay. You'll be pleased to know that James has posted a set of publications that may be of interest to people. So thank you for that. Thank you for that, James. Thank you for responding to that. I'm just scanning through the questions on the chat. There's nothing else in the Q&A. We've got 5 more minutes, but there are 1 or 2 comments, Hugh. I wonder if you could pick up on more comments about screening.
Sure.
Working with autistic children. I'm wondering about, so this is sort of pertinent to kind of, I mean, obviously you raise issues about, neurodiversity. It's not just about head injury. It's about children with atypical processing, if you like. And maybe I can ask my question, which I ask you all the time, which is where this takes us politically. Because I get, a lot of what you're saying is politically framed, isn't it? About what we need to do in terms of the broader socio-political environment and how it neglects this group. But I also wonder, one of the perhaps more challenging questions I've heard you being asked, and I've asked you a number of times, is sometimes a brain injury angle or a neurotypicality, atypical framing sort of creates an impression that this is brain related. It's some kind of endogenous, organic, immutable problem that therefore can't be shifted. And it plays into a very politically distinct position, which is actually once people have these brains, there's not very much we can do to repair them. So there's kind of idea about a criminal brain. Clearly that's not a message you want.
And Broadstone and all of that.
Do you have a response to that kind of the danger of something being politically misinterpreted?
Yes, absolutely. Ingram, and absolutely right. I mean, you don't want some kind of reiteration of some kind of reductionist wrong-headedness. And one of the key issues is that maybe for some kids and young people, there may be something about the brain injury that's it. That's going to be a lifelong neuro disability. But that doesn't mean that you can give up, because I work with Barbara and John in all of this angle, and lots of other neuro rehab would show you can get people back to work. You can reduce their suicidality. You can do all kinds of stuff with relatively straightforward, low-tech, high-gain sort of systems, right? You can do that. It's a case of the investment in that. And the political side is to do with, it's a tricky kind of balancing act, but the But what we've been able to do is to work with, say, the Justice Committee in the UK Parliament around getting across the points in a way that they can see what the value is long term. So behind this, there's a lot of work that's gone into education of politicians and so on. Even Michael Gove, I had an interesting meeting with him. So it's kind of when he was Secretary of State. So it's about making sure that people understand the nuances of what's going on. There is developmental capacity, clearly, and also there's developmental risks for banging kids up. It's not good for their brains. It's not good for their behaviour. And there's really nice neuroscience of play. Play is training for the unexpected. Also, play is associated with increased dendritic and axonal growth patterns in the frontal lobes. So you can shift this into a neuroscience of hope and capacity for change. And you can reduce the chances of kids going to becoming, adult offenders by targeting interventions around their needs. That's why I like to do it profiler, because people might come across that, because it's about needs and what can be done. What help do you need to get through this to the next thing? So I think the money argument needs to be done, because it's about arguing for why do we spend £650 a night for a kid in secure accommodation? £650 a night. More expensive than your usual holidays away on the weekend, just slightly. And it's a shocker that there's so much resource tied up around crime that could be used more effectively to reduce the future crime. But and so you're right. And where I kind of started with this years ago was talking to a colleague, Claudia Hammond, All in the Mind, and I asked her for advice about how to get the story out about brain injury in kids, and because of brain injury being violent, or increased risk of violence. And she said, well, come on my program and explain it. So I did. And the next day, The Guardian ran the story saying all these vulnerable kids ending up in the criminal justice system, more needs to be done. The Daily Mail ran a story that said all these vulnerable kids ending up in the criminal justice system, more needs to be done. Trajectory kind of affected. So it's about trying to make sure that the narrative is, in the current narrative, is science-based, but not then hijacked. That's an important thing. And I often wonder about being, work in a political sphere. It's so important to retain independence in terms of giving evidence, so you're not providing information that then is kind of politically utilized, but science.
Hugh, we've just got a couple of minutes if we're going to stick to time, and I think in terms of the hour,
Yep.
Henry makes the comment, which I think you've picked up on, about interventions that might be effective in alleviating difficulties, whether these are cognitive or social, emotional. I just leave that, whether you want to comment on that, but there's also...
very briefly, very briefly on that. The Disability Trust report that we did on putting link workers into prisons was great. We had about 20 case studies of kids who feared going home because they were being abused, or kids who were suicidal with ADHD and so on and so forth. And one had 100 knockouts because he was being used by his parents as to make money out of boxing matches, illegal betting. So lots of, so interventions that at the heart of it is brain injury rehabilitation, but around it there's a system that you need to manage and deal with. Yeah. Great. Any other questions?
Yeah, it was Peter Tucker mentions a hopeful point. I don't know if you want to respond to this, but it's always nice to end on a hopeful note, isn't it? A lot of the stuff that you're saying is quite difficult to hear, isn't it? And I suppose that's one of the reasons why, there are challenges from all kinds of different directions. But Peter comments that he said, on a hopeful note, which pre-COVID at least, is the all-party parliamentary group listening, and is stuff changing politically, or is this a kind of slow burner?
No, and if you track the number of times brain injury has been mentioned in Hansard, it's gone up dramatically over the last few years. So it's on the political agenda. The various people who are in the cabinet have taken note of it. Some have come in and out. Philip Lee, who's been great. Gork was great, in and out. But we're keeping a pressure. Chris Bryant is fantastic as the MP pushing for this, and he's very vocal. Do tweet him, Ingram. And Lord Ramsbotham. So in the Lords, we've got Lord Ramsbotham, who's with our Criminal Justice Not Acquired Brain Injury Group. Lots going on there. currently probation and prison systems, how we can get with Disability Trust, how we can work with to get brain injury rehabilitation in COVID times. That's going on. And then the reminder that if one of the big problems for people who offend is that they don't remember where they should be or they're impulsive, then texts and all the rest of it to help them remember what they should be doing and all the rest of it is very useful. So that's percolating into the system and not going away. And hopefully, as things evolve, there will be more opportunities to put on a neuro health kind of angle to these things. So yeah, and Chris is great on the education side of things too, and keep pressing home across. The nice thing with Chris Bryant is that he's so good at working across Parliament, and Lord Ramsworth doesn't work so good as well, but working across Parliament. So there's a really good sort of team of parliamentarians who've got, they've got the skills.
Hugh, there's a lot of interest, I think, just in the chat about the fetal alcohol stuff. Indices of deprivation, difficult starts, adoption work. So I guess those are things that we might consider going forward. I know that just to flag up, Rebecca Bromley, I think who was online earlier on, is talking in a couple of weeks' time about neurotoxic effects in utero, with specific reference to her epilepsy work. We've got Steve Weatherhead talking about homelessness and neuropsychology. There's kind of lots of stuff with an interface in the kind of political and social deprivation side. So that's all kind of feeding into the audience interest very well. Hugh, can I thank you very much for opening in such an excellent and vibrant way, and convincing us all of the importance of a focus on brain injury and deprivation and neuro. I'm struggling with a word, neuroatypicality. Someone's going to tell me what the word is, and I'll be embarrassed. You can tell me. You're right there. Tell me what phrase I should be using. I've got too many syllables in there.
Yeah, no,
neurodiversity.
I think in the right territory.
Are you happy with neurodiversity?
We're coming up with new